The Verger's Dark Secret, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins inside the quiet village church, where the verger has served faithfully for years, opening the doors each morning, lighting the candles, and ensuring that everything runs with quiet precision. To the villagers, he is a familiar and trusted figure, someone who knows every corner of the church and every secret it holds. But when an unsettling discovery is made within those ancient walls, Miss Marple begins to question the small details others overlook, the keys that only the verger possessed, the strange hours he kept, and the way certain questions are met with uneasy silence. The deeper she looks, the clearer it becomes that the church has been keeping more than spiritual secrets. Because sometimes, the darkest truths are hidden in the most sacred places. Before we uncover what the verger was truly hiding, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Verger's Dark Secret. On a quiet Sunday morning in St. Mary Mead, the church bell rang with its usual steady rhythm, calling the faithful to worship beneath a pale and gentle sky. The village appeared peaceful, wrapped in that familiar stillness that so often gives the illusion of safety. Parishioners walked along the narrow stone path toward the old church, exchanging polite greetings, unaware that before the hour was over, the calm surface of their community would fracture. Inside the vestry, behind a heavy oak door rarely noticed by casual visitors, a man lay motionless on the cold stone floor. Mr. Harold Finch, church warden and guardian of parish finances for nearly 20 years, had been struck down only minutes before the congregation began to gather. It was the verger, Thomas Bellamy, who claimed to have found him. Bellamy had stepped into the vestry shortly before service to prepare the robes and arrange the morning records. According to his account, he left briefly to collect fresh linens from a nearby cupboard. When he returned, Mr. Finch was already on the floor, unmoving, one hand stretched toward the cabinet that held decades of church documents. At first glance, it appeared as though the warden had slipped and fallen, perhaps striking his head against the corner of a wooden table. But there was something too precise about the thin wound near his temple, something too deliberate in its placement to satisfy the explanation of an accident. Miss Marple was seated near the rear pew when the disturbance spread through the church like a ripple across water. She did not rush forward in alarm, nor did she indulge in speculation. She watched. Observation had long been her habit, and she understood that truth often reveals itself in the smallest gestures rather than in the loudest declarations. Her eyes lingered on Thomas Bellamy as he spoke to the first constable who arrived. The verger's voice was steady, his hands calm, his manner composed. For a man who had just discovered a body, his control was remarkable. Inspector Clark from the nearby town arrived shortly thereafter, bringing with him a quiet authority and a sharp attention to detail. He examined the vestry carefully. The cabinet drawer beside the body had been opened. Several folders were missing, though no sign of forced entry could be found on the lock. The room itself showed no evidence of struggle. The brass candle snuffer resting on its stand near the cabinet gleamed under the dim light, recently polished to a high shine. Nothing appeared overturned. Nothing appeared broken. Yet something essential was absent. When asked who possessed keys to the cabinet, the answer was simple. Mr. Finch had one. The rector had another. And Thomas Bellamy, as verger, held the third. The rector, visibly shaken by the death of his colleague, insisted he had not entered the vestry that morning until summoned. His distress appeared genuine, almost overwhelming. Bellamy, by contrast, seemed measured in his grief, careful in his words, and precise in every detail he offered. He stated that his key had remained in his coat pocket all morning, unused. It was a statement delivered without hesitation. As the day progressed, whispers moved through the village. Some speculated about outsiders, though none had been seen entering the church grounds. Others wondered quietly whether disagreements within the parish council might have escalated. It was known that Mr. Finch had been reviewing financial records in recent weeks. Small inconsistencies had surfaced in the church accounts. Donations recorded did not perfectly match the amounts deposited. At first, the differences were minor, easily dismissed as counting errors. But over time, the pattern had become difficult to ignore. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a discreet visit to Mrs. Dalton, the widow who assisted in tallying weekly collections. Over tea, Mrs. Dalton admitted that Mr. Finch had confided in her shortly before his death. He suspected someone had been removing small sums from the donations over the course of many months. The amounts were never large enough to provoke immediate alarm, but collectively they represented a troubling deficit. Mr. Finch intended to confront the matter directly. He had asked for access to older records to compare handwriting and corrections. When Miss Marple returned to the church later that evening, she noticed a detail that others had overlooked. The cabinet's index sheet, listing the contents and revisions of each financial ledger, remained inside the drawer. Though several full ledgers were missing, the index had not been removed. It recorded specific pages where adjustments had been made in recent months. The handwriting marking those corrections did not match Mr. Finch's. Instead, it bore a resemblance to another sample Miss Marple had seen not long ago. Months earlier, Thomas Bellamy had written a formal letter requesting assistance from a local bank. His sister required medical treatment in another town, and the costs had exceeded his modest income. The loan application had been declined. The handwriting in that letter was neat, controlled, and slightly angular. The same careful strokes appeared in the corrections noted in the church ledger index. The following morning, Inspector Clark shared preliminary medical findings. The wound to Mr. Finch's temple was not consistent with a fall. It had been caused by a blunt object, narrow but solid, applied with deliberate force. The brass candle snuffer in the vestry fit that description precisely. Though no visible traces of blood remained upon it, its surface had been polished so recently that even the faintest marks would have been erased. The verger was known for his attention to cleanliness. He prided himself on maintaining the church in immaculate condition. When questioned again about the financial discrepancies, Bellamy expressed restrained indignation. He suggested that mistakes were inevitable in volunteer accounting and that Mr. Finch had perhaps become overly suspicious. Yet beneath his calm demeanor, there flickered something that Miss Marple recognized from years of observing human nature. It was not fear alone. It was pride mixed with desperation, a dangerous combination. Gradually, the pieces aligned. Thomas Bellamy had access to the collection plates each week. He handled the funds before they were secured. Removing small amounts over an extended period would have been simple for someone in his position. His sister's medical expenses provided motive. Pride prevented him from admitting hardship openly. Instead, he convinced himself that borrowing small sums, intending perhaps to repay them later, was a temporary solution. But when Mr. Finch uncovered the pattern and confronted him that Sunday morning, the situation shifted from quiet deception to imminent exposure. Exposure meant dismissal. Dismissal meant disgrace within a village where reputation was everything. Without employment, Bellamy would lose not only his income but his standing. His sister's treatment would cease. Faced with that threat, he made a calculated decision. There was no evidence of struggle because none occurred. The conversation likely began calmly. Mr. Finch, holding the ledger, may have demanded explanation. Bellamy, realizing the depth of discovery, reached for the nearest object capable of silencing further accusation. The strike was swift and controlled, delivered with more precision than rage. Afterward, he removed the most incriminating ledgers, intending to destroy them later. He polished the candle snuffer, restored the room to order, and stepped out briefly to create the appearance of absence. Upon his return, he performed the role of shock discoverer with remarkable composure. He rang the church bell as usual. He greeted parishioners as though nothing had occurred. He trusted that the death would be judged an accident and that the missing documents might be attributed to confusion in the aftermath. But he underestimated Miss Marple. She understood that true accidents rarely tidy themselves. She understood that theft conducted slowly over months requires discipline and patience. And she understood that a man driven by pride may convince himself that one final decisive act will protect everything he loves. Thomas Bellamy did not begin as a murderer. He began as a desperate brother unwilling to accept humiliation. Each small theft became easier than the last, until exposure forced his hand. By the time evening's shadows stretched across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple was certain that the verger's secret ran deeper than grief or coincidence. It was built upon months of concealed misappropriation, rooted in financial strain, and sealed by a single fatal blow. The calm surface of the village had hidden a quiet erosion of trust. Now that erosion had claimed a life. As rain began to fall against the church windows that night, the bell tower stood dark and silent. Within those ancient walls lingered the truth of what had transpired. A man who believed he could control the consequences of his choices had instead set in motion his own undoing. And by morning, the evidence would speak clearly enough for even the most skeptical to hear. The verger's dark secret was no longer hidden. It was merely waiting to be revealed. Chapter 2: The Verger's Deception. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had lost its quiet certainty. The news of Harold Finch's death spread through the village with the unsettling speed that only small communities possess. People spoke in lowered voices near garden fences and shop counters, repeating the same questions again and again. How could such a thing happen inside the church? How could a man like Mr. Finch die so suddenly, and under such strange circumstances? For many of the villagers, the idea of violence entering their familiar church seemed almost impossible to accept. Yet Inspector Clark did not deal in comfort or illusion. His task was to examine the facts, and the facts were beginning to take shape in ways that made the explanation of a simple accident increasingly difficult to sustain. The vestry was examined again that morning, this time with far greater care. Every surface was studied. Every object was noted. The brass candle snuffer, shining with unnatural brightness, drew particular attention. Its weight and shape made it a perfect instrument for delivering a narrow but powerful strike. The inspector had already sent it away for closer examination, though he suspected that if it had been cleaned as thoroughly as it appeared, little evidence would remain. Thomas Bellamy continued his duties as verger with remarkable discipline. He unlocked the church doors at the usual hour, swept the stone floors, and arranged the prayer books with the same careful precision he had always shown. To anyone watching from a distance, he appeared to be a man faithfully continuing his work despite the shock of tragedy. But Inspector Clark was not easily persuaded by appearances. When the inspector questioned Bellamy again, the verger answered every inquiry with calm politeness. He repeated his story without alteration. He had stepped away from the vestry for a few minutes to retrieve linens. When he returned, he found Mr. Finch on the floor. That was all he claimed to know. His voice never wavered, and his eyes met the inspector's gaze steadily. However, Miss Marple noticed something different. She had come quietly to the church that morning, walking slowly along the path with her usual thoughtful expression. She did not interrupt the questioning. Instead, she observed from a small distance, her attention fixed on the verger's hands. Bellamy's voice was steady, but his fingers were not. Whenever the conversation drifted toward the missing financial records, his hands tightened slightly around the edge of the wooden chair beside him. The movement was small, almost invisible. But to someone trained in watching human nature, it was unmistakable. A man who tells the truth does not prepare himself so carefully for every sentence. Later that afternoon, Inspector Clark began examining the financial situation that had surrounded Harold Finch in the weeks before his death. It became increasingly clear that the church accounts had indeed been under quiet investigation. Mr. Finch had been studying the ledgers closely, reviewing entries made over the past year. The problem was not one large missing amount. It was something subtler. Small donations had been recorded inconsistently. In several instances, the numbers written in the ledger had been adjusted slightly after the initial entry. A £5 donation might appear as 4. 10 might become 8. Individually, the differences seemed trivial. But when added across months of services, the total loss grew substantial. Whoever had altered those records had done so with patience. And with access. Only a handful of people ever handled the church collections before they were locked away. Harold Finch was one. Mrs. Dalton sometimes assisted with counting. But the man who handled the collection plates first every single week was Thomas Bellamy. Inspector Clark visited Mrs. Dalton that evening. The elderly widow, though nervous at being questioned, confirmed something important. Mr. Finch had recently told her he believed someone was taking small amounts from the donations before they were recorded properly. He had planned to confront the matter directly the very morning he died. Miss Marple listened carefully when the inspector later shared this information. She folded her hands thoughtfully and considered the sequence of events. If Mr. Finch intended to confront someone, she said quietly, then that person would have known exposure was only moments away. Inspector Clark nodded slowly. Which gives motive, he replied. Yes, Miss Marple agreed gently. But motive alone does not complete the story. Because something about Thomas Bellamy's behavior suggested that the killing had not been a sudden act of panic. It had been too controlled. Too tidy. A man who strikes in blind fear rarely thinks to remove documents immediately afterward. That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village. She had lived long enough to know that people reveal more in ordinary conversation than they do under formal questioning. Near the small grocery shop, she encountered Mr. Carter, the postmaster, who mentioned something curious. Thomas Bellamy had received several letters over the past year from a medical office in another town. The letters arrived regularly and always appeared urgent. Miss Marple thanked him and continued walking, her thoughts turning carefully. A sister requiring treatment. Expensive treatment. Financial pressure. The pattern was becoming clearer. But there was still one piece missing. If Bellamy had taken small sums from the church donations over many months, why had Harold Finch only discovered the discrepancy recently? Someone careful enough to steal gradually would likely also be careful about covering his records. The answer revealed itself the following morning when Inspector Clark reported something new. Among the documents found in Mr. Finch's home was a personal notebook. Inside it were several pages of calculations written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Finch had been comparing weekly donations with older records and attendance numbers. His conclusion suggested that the discrepancies had begun almost exactly 10 months earlier. 10 months. Miss Marple remembered the timeline immediately. 10 months ago was precisely when Bellamy's sister had first required medical treatment. The thefts had begun with desperation. But desperation can grow into habit. And habit can become something far darker. Meanwhile, Thomas Bellamy continued maintaining the appearance of perfect composure. Yet inside his small cottage at the edge of the village, his confidence was beginning to crack. The missing ledgers remained hidden beneath a loose floorboard. He had intended to burn them immediately after the incident, but the presence of investigators had made that impossible. Each day they remained undiscovered increased his fear. Bellamy told himself he had acted to protect his sister. He told himself the thefts were temporary. But deep down he knew that Harold Finch had uncovered everything. The confrontation in the vestry had not been mild. Finch had threatened to report the matter to the parish council immediately. In that moment, Bellamy had seen his entire life collapsing. The strike had come almost without thought, but once it was done, the verger's careful mind had returned. He removed the ledgers that contained the clearest proof. He polished the candle snuffer. He stepped away from the room to create the appearance of innocence. And then he rang the church bell. But now the quiet old woman in the village was watching him. Miss Marple paid a visit to the church once more that afternoon. She stood alone inside the empty nave, listening to the echo of distant footsteps. Thomas Bellamy entered moments later, carrying a small bundle of cleaning cloths. Their eyes met briefly. Bellamy greeted her politely, but Miss Marple sensed something beneath his calm tone. It was not guilt exactly. It was tension, like a rope stretched too tightly. She spoke to him kindly about Mr. Finch and the sadness of the situation. Bellamy responded with respectful sorrow. Yet when Miss Marple mentioned that Mr. Finch had been reviewing financial records recently, the verger's expression changed for just a moment. It was a flicker. But it was enough. Miss Marple left the church certain of one thing. Thomas Bellamy had committed the crime not only out of fear but out of belief that his intelligence would allow him to escape suspicion. That belief would prove to be his greatest mistake. Because Inspector Clark had just received confirmation that the candle snuffer, though polished, still contained microscopic traces of blood within a narrow seam near its base. The blood matched Harold Finch. The weapon had spoken. But Miss Marple knew something else mattered even more than physical evidence. Truth has a way of tightening around those who try to escape it. And Thomas Bellamy's deception was beginning to unravel. By the end of the week, the quiet verger of St. Mary Mead would face the moment he had feared most, the moment when every careful lie collapsed beneath the weight of a single undeniable fact. The secret he believed buried would soon stand exposed before the entire village. And there would be no bell left to ring for mercy. Chapter 3: The Verger's Secret Revealed. By the middle of the week, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had changed in a way that everyone could feel but few could clearly describe. The village still looked the same. The narrow lanes curved past the same cottages. The church bell still rang in the morning and evening. But beneath that familiar rhythm lay a quiet tension. People spoke more softly when passing the churchyard. Conversations paused whenever Thomas Bellamy appeared nearby. No one accused him openly, yet something about the situation had begun to trouble even those who wished to believe the best of him. Inspector Clark understood that the moment was approaching when the truth could no longer remain hidden. The examination of the brass candle snuffer had produced the confirmation he needed. Though the metal surface had been polished carefully, a narrow seam near its base had trapped traces of blood that cleaning cloths could not reach. The laboratory report left little room for doubt. The blood belonged to Harold Finch. Yet the inspector also knew that presenting evidence alone would not necessarily lead to a confession. Men like Thomas Bellamy often held tightly to their stories until the final possible moment. What he needed was pressure, and pressure applied in the right way could cause even the most disciplined liar to falter. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the inspector's office that afternoon, understood this perfectly. She had spent a lifetime observing how pride shapes human behavior. In her experience, men who commit crimes out of desperation often convince themselves that their actions were justified. They begin to see themselves not as criminals but as victims of circumstance. Confronting such a person directly with accusation can cause them to retreat deeper into denial. "Mr. Bellamy is a careful man," she said thoughtfully. "He will not confess merely because we present evidence. He must see that the truth has already been understood." Inspector Clark nodded slowly. "You believe he will speak if he thinks the matter is already settled?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Because then his pride will seek one last comfort. He will wish to explain himself." The inspector considered this approach and soon agreed that it was worth attempting. A meeting was arranged for the following morning in the vestry where the crime had taken place. The setting itself would serve a purpose. The room held the memory of that fatal moment, and such memories have a powerful effect on the human mind. Thomas Bellamy arrived precisely on time. He entered the vestry with his usual controlled posture, though his eyes moved quickly across the room as if measuring every detail. Inspector Clark stood beside the wooden cabinet where the missing ledgers had once been kept. Miss Marple sat quietly in a chair near the wall, her hands folded calmly in her lap. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched long enough to make Bellamy uncomfortable. Finally, Inspector Clark began in a steady voice. He explained that the investigation had uncovered important developments. The candle snuffer had been examined. The blood discovered within its seam had been identified as belonging to Harold Finch. The inspector described this evidence carefully, without raising his voice or showing anger. Bellamy listened without interruption. His expression remained composed, but the color had begun to drain slowly from his face. Inspector Clark then explained that Harold Finch's personal notebook had revealed the warden's investigation into church finances. The pattern of missing donations had been traced over 10 months, beginning at the exact time Bellamy's sister had begun receiving medical treatment in another town. Still the verger said nothing. But his hands had begun to tremble. Miss Marple watched him with quiet sympathy. She knew that the moment had arrived when the final truth must be spoken aloud. "Mr. Bellamy," she said softly, "Mr. Finch confronted you on Sunday morning, did he not?" The verger's eyes moved toward her. For the first time since the meeting began, uncertainty appeared in his expression. Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone. She described the likely sequence of events with calm precision. Harold Finch had summoned Bellamy into the vestry after discovering the altered records. He had demanded an explanation for the missing funds. Bellamy had tried to defend himself, perhaps even insisting that he intended to replace the money once his sister recovered. But Finch had not accepted those explanations. He had insisted that the matter must be reported to the parish council. The consequences would have been severe. Dismissal from his position. Public disgrace within the village. The end of his reputation as a trusted servant of the church. Bellamy closed his eyes briefly. Miss Marple continued. She explained that in that moment Bellamy saw everything he had built about his life collapsing. The shame alone would have been unbearable. Worse still, losing his employment meant he could no longer help his sister continue her treatment. Fear and pride together created a terrible pressure. Bellamy had reached for the nearest object capable of ending the confrontation. The brass candle snuffer. The strike had been quick and controlled. Harold Finch had fallen instantly. Realizing what he had done, Bellamy's careful mind took control again. He removed the ledgers containing the most damaging evidence, polished the weapon, and stepped away briefly to create the illusion that he had just discovered the body upon returning. Miss Marple's voice remained calm as she finished the explanation. You believed that if the death appeared accidental, the matter would end there. The missing records might never be questioned. And your secret would remain safe. The room fell silent again. For several seconds, Bellamy stared at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded very different from the confident tone he had used before. I never meant for it to happen, he said quietly. Inspector Clark did not interrupt. Bellamy continued speaking slowly, as though each word carried a heavy weight. He described the months of growing financial pressure as his sister's medical bills increased. At first he had only taken a small amount from the donations, believing he would replace it later. But the costs continued to rise, and each week the temptation to take a little more became easier to justify. Harold Finch's discovery had destroyed the fragile illusion Bellamy had created for himself. When he said he would report me, Bellamy whispered, I saw everything ending. My work, my home, my sister's treatment. All of it gone. He paused before adding the final words. I struck him before I even realized I had moved. The confession ended there. Inspector Clark placed Bellamy under arrest quietly. There was no struggle. The verger seemed almost relieved as the weight of his deception finally lifted. Later that evening, as the village absorbed the truth of what had happened, Miss Marple walked slowly past the churchyard. The bell tower stood silent against the fading sky. She reflected on the strange path that had led Thomas Bellamy from desperation to theft, from theft to murder. Human nature, she often believed, was not divided simply between good and evil. More often it was shaped by small choices made under pressure. Each choice could lead either toward honesty or toward concealment. Once a person begins hiding the truth, the path back becomes increasingly difficult to find. Bellamy had taken that path step by step until he reached a moment where violence seemed like the only escape. But the truth, as it so often does, had found its way into the light. Within days the story of the VERGER'S crime spread beyond St. Mary Mead. Newspapers reported the strange tragedy of a trusted church servant who had hidden a dark secret behind years of careful duty. Yet for the villagers who had known both men, the story carried a deeper sadness. Harold Finch had died trying to protect the integrity of the church he loved. Thomas Bellamy had destroyed his own life trying to protect a lie. And in the quiet village where everyone believed they understood their neighbors, the case became a reminder that even the most ordinary faces can conceal extraordinary secrets. Miss Marple paused at the church gate before turning toward home. She hoped that the lesson of the tragedy would remain long after the headlines faded. Pride and secrecy, when allowed to grow unchecked, can lead even decent people toward terrible decisions. Justice had been done, but justice could not restore the life that had been lost. The church bell would ring again on Sunday, calling the village to gather as it always had. Yet those who listened closely would remember the week when silence fell over St. Mary Mead, and the truth of the VERGE'S dark secret was finally revealed. And if you enjoy mysteries where hidden motives slowly unfold and quiet villages conceal dangerous truths, be sure to stay with this channel for more stories just like this one. There are many more mysteries waiting to be uncovered, and the next secret may be even darker than the last.